Hi, everyone. Welcome back once again. Excuse me, to Reverence for Reverie. And I am so glad that you're here with me for this month's Oracle card transmission. And this is for the collective. So every month, I am going to spend some time pulling cards. And from my perspective, this isn't about predicting the future or giving some sort of neat answer, but it's just really to open up a dialogue. And it's a dialogue, as I see it, between the unconscious and the conscious, also between what we might call the archetypal and the personal, as well as between the collective field and the individual psyche. So for this month, the month of October 2025, the cards seemed to speak with a lot of clarity. And I felt immediately that they certainly were not just meant for me, but for us as a whole, for this community, those of us that are walking this path of um, just soul-led leadership and depth and moving towards more inner coherence. And what I really love about oracle cards or this kind of maybe we would call it the divination tool, right? This kind of work is that it's not really about fortune telling. It's about resonance, because a card or an image or a phrase will touch something inside of us. And it touches something, it's a truth that it touches that's already waiting there. It's already very present and alive in your psyche, in the unconscious. So when you see it outside of you in form of a symbol, and the symbol would be the card, the image, the phrase, um, when we actually name it and we give it that space, it begins to move. It begins to do its work within us, right? So I really invite you, as you listen, to not just hear my words, but actually to notice, what does this stir in you? What memories or other associations rise to the surface without filtering, just allowing yourself to notice what you notice? Maybe you notice resistance, actually. Maybe there's irritation, anger, right? Any of that is welcome, because that's actually the real transmission here. Whenever I bring something to you, it's not me telling you what the cards mean. All of that is from my perspective right now, but it's actually about you listening to what they awaken in you. And every individual is going to hear that differently. So this month's cards are speaking to the ideas of karma and freedom, courage and embodiment, and to the remembrance of our own inner brilliance. And really, as I sat with them, I recognized they were really telling a single story. And so I've tried to lay them out in that way throughout this episode. But this is a story about what it takes to really become more of ourselves, to step through the doorways that fear is often guarding, and then to stand up more unapologetically in our own presence. And I think that's really what we're all being asked to do in this phase in time. You know, I don't know what October holds for us. I don't know if this will resonate for everyone, but I am very aware that collectively, what these cards speak to seem to be something I'm even seeing very clearly in my own practice with clients, that it's kind of surfacing for all of us, really. So let's go ahead and begin. All right. So the first deck I pulled from this month was Voice of the Soul's Oracle. This is by Isabel Surf, and it's illustrated by Daphne Sabane. I may be saying these incorrectly. The cards that came forward together from this deck were karma and freedom. And if you're signed up to my email newsletter, you're going to see an image of the cards that I've pulled and the decks that they come from. So make sure you take a look at that for this month. Now, when most of us hear the word karma, there's often this immediate association with like punishment or some kind of cosmic bookkeeping system, if you will. Like if you do something bad, then something so-called bad will happen to you. But I actually understand karma a little differently than that. So the way that I understand karma and the way I think these cards are speaking to me this month is much more intimate than that. And for reference, I want to point to, again, my own trade that I'm coming from, which is in the field of psychology and psychoanalysis in particular. And we talk about something called the repetition compulsion. This is the tendency that we all have, every single one of us, no one escapes it, to find ourselves drawn again and again into the same kinds of patterns. It's the same kinds of relationships that will echo old wounds, the same sorts of situations that will stir some sort of familiar pain, and the same inner battles that we thought that we had already overcome at one other point. So it's like life keeps handing us this same script, and there's just different characters, different faces, different hair, but it's the same lesson at the end of the day, wearing some new clothes, right? Does this feel familiar for anyone? So why does this happen? It's because there's something in us that's longing to be seen. There's something in us that's asking to be worked through and transformed. And in that way, I don't believe that karma is about punishment. I see it as this psyche's way of insisting, like, pay attention here. Don't look away. This right here is where your freedom lies. So here's a way that we could maybe think about that. If life is some grand classroom, right? Karma is the subject that we just keep getting re-enrolled in until we're passing the exam, right? And in this case, passing an exam doesn't mean perfection, like getting 100%. It actually really means finally bringing our conscious awareness to what is actually happening rather than blindly repeating over and over and over again. And then I think this is exactly where the freedom card comes in. True freedom is not actually found in avoiding everything that's painful and inconvenient in our lives. I hate to burst your bubble, but that just is not what happens. And it's not about numbing ourselves or distracting ourselves or pretending that there isn't a lesson here for us, right? True freedom is found when we walk directly into the discomfort, when we name what has been unnamed, when we begin to shine a light on all of the patterns that otherwise have kept us really bound up and stuck. So when we bring consciousness to this repetition, when we're willing to say, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. I see what this is. The compulsion to repeat it begins to dissolve. Maybe it doesn't immediately resolve or dissolve, but it begins to shift. And suddenly we are then freed up for new choices, new ways of being, new ways of acting. Suddenly we become more free. And it's not just freer to avoid our suffering, but freer to build, freer to create, freer to imagine something new, more free to enjoy the life and whatever legacy that we have come here to live. Now, of course, there is always resistance to this process. Resistance to seeing what's actually been right in front of us. There's quite a lot of effort that goes into us not knowing what we know. So there's resistance to letting go of what's familiar, even when that familiar thing hurts us. In fact, again, psychoanalytically, resistance is one of the clearest signs that there's something very important at stake right where we're at. That resistance is actually the gatekeeper of our freedom. And the work here is not to shame ourselves for feeling the resistance. we're all going to feel resistance. It's human. And it's the way that our brain is programmed. It's for protection, even when what is supposedly protecting us, which is the familiarity and the safety, is actually harming us, right? So it's not about shaming ourselves for feeling it, but instead recognizing it as the invitation. What would it mean to walk through this doorway rather than continuing to turn away from it again and again? So as you hear this, I am just going to invite you to ask yourself, where in my life do I notice the same patterns repeating? What situation, what relationship, what inner struggles continue to keep circling back? And then what might open up for me if I were willing to face that differently this time? Because here's the thing, karma and freedom aren't opposites. They're actually partners, right? Karma is the teacher that keeps returning. And freedom, I'm going to go back to this classroom reference, right? Freedom is like the diploma that we earn when we finally are willing to sit with the lesson that karma is bringing for us. All right. Let's move on to the second deck that I pulled from. And that was the Work Your Light Oracle by Rebecca Campbell with artwork by Danielle Noel or Noel. So again, in this deck, 2 cards came forward together. And just a little bit of information on how I usually do this. So I go into it with the intention of a single card from at least 3 decks. Like 3 decks is what usually speaks to me. And I kind of just choose those intuitively. And my intention is at least 1 card from each of them. However, if when I'm shuffling, or if I just get an intuitive sense to pull another card, or if I'm shuffling to finish that sentence, if more than 1 card falls out, I take that as what was meant to be, right? So in that first deck, 2 cards fell out while I was shuffling. In this deck from Rebecca Campbell, 2 cards fell out while I was shuffling. And so the 2 cards that came forward together from this deck were Warrior Woman. And the statement underneath where it says Warrior Woman is, have you answered your deepest calling? And then the second card was Pillar of Light. The statement under that is, your vibration is rising. You are the oracle. So that first card, Warrior Woman, I believe it brings us directly into the archetype of courage. And I do think it's really important to say here that courage is not the absence of fear. You can't have courage without fear. So it's really the willingness to move forward in the very presence of fear. In fact, the guidebook for this card says the more resistance that we have toward answering the call, the more important it is for our own soul's growth. And I just want, that's very apropos to what we were just talking about, the idea of resistance, right? So that is such a potent reminder, because so often when we're feeling that resistance and when we feel fear begin to rise in our body, our instinct is to step back and to avoid and tell ourselves all kinds of things, right? The timing isn't right. I'm not ready. Okay, maybe this isn't for me. What was I thinking? Like all of those kinds of things will come up, right? But what if that trembling in our chest is really the compass for us? Like, what if our fear is pointing directly towards our initiation? And I think, whenever I think of the warrior archetype, the warrior is not reckless. They're not careless. A warrior isn't just charging into battle for the sake of battle, right? The warrior is listening, feeling the fear, I'm sure, feeling the shaking, but then steps forward anyway. They know what lies on the other side is worth it, and they're willing to risk something. They're willing to sacrifice something. So I want to pause here and connect this back to those first cards, karma and freedom, because the very places where we actually resist the most and where we fear the most are these exact places the deepest work is calling us. So again, karma, setting that lesson, fear signals its importance, and courage, becoming the warrior woman or man, that is the act that will open up the gate. All right, so paired with warrior woman was also the card pillar of light. This one really feels like the answer to that warrior's journey. If the warrior archetype is about stepping into the fire, I think the pillar of light archetype is about what we become when we actually are willing to walk through that. This card is really speaking of becoming the conduit, like the channel where heaven and earth meet. This is like the remembering that we are our own oracle. The wisdom that we long for isn't sitting somewhere outside of us, waiting for someone else to deliver it to us. It's really already alive inside of us. We are the ones resisting that information most often, right? And here is the key. So to truly live as this sort of pillar of light, if you want to imagine it like that, it's not like we just float upward into some spiritual abstraction. We cannot bypass the body. We cannot bypass our wounds. And we certainly cannot bypass this messy terrain of being human. We have to actually descend fully into ourselves, into our bodies, into the places we'd rather be avoiding, because it's only through that kind of descent that the higher wisdom can actually even be embodied. And right here, integration is the word that is coming up for me. So to integrate heaven and earth is not just some metaphor. I think it is to recognize that whatever we might perceive as divine is not meant to just stay up in the clouds or in some far off afterlife. I think it's actually meant to be lived and breathed and acted on right now. It's meant to shape how we move through our relationships, in our relationships, how we create in our life, how we lead others, right? I think this is where so many of us can get so tripped up. We are always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We'll look for gurus or other systems or some form of external validation. But I think this card is reminding us we are our own guru. We are the oracle. The guidance that we need is already housed within us, but we've got to get quiet enough and allow ourselves to really listen to it. The work then becomes clearing the static, and there is all kinds of static that can really prevent us from hearing our own inner voice and our own inner wisdom. So the work then, like I said, is to clear that static, to move through the resistance so that we can actually begin to hear and embody the wisdom that we hold within us. So once again, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. What are you being called to step forward into, even though fear is present? And then what would it look like, not just to receive some guidance from above or outside of you, but to actually embody that here in your daily choices, in your own leadership, in your relationships? Because I think that when the warrior takes the step, that is when the pillar of light really begins to shine. And when we begin to shine out of presence, out of our ability to be present with ourselves, we also create this space where others remember that they too are their own oracle. They embody light as well. And they're able to take up that space, and it ripples into the collective. All right. And finally, the final deck that I pulled from this month was Kyle Gray's Gateway of Light Activation Oracle. This is illustrated by Jennifer Hawkyard. And the card that came forward from this one was I Am Presence, accessing the divine within, light body activation. So once again, very apropos to everything we're already talking about. It feels like the culmination of the journey that we've already just been walking through. So if karma and freedom show us the patterns that we need to face, and then the warrior woman, along with the pillar of light, invite us into courage and embodiment, then I think the I am presence is actually just the flowering of that work. The way that I see it, to stand in the I am is to return to the deepest truths of who we are, not an identity that we've constructed for other people's approval, not all of the masks that we've worn for our survival, not the version of ourselves that has learned how to fit and how to hide and how to perform and how to placate and how to essentially contort ourselves into the boxes of our conditioning or our society. But instead, the essence, right? The presence of our authentic way of being. And in many traditions, this presence is named as the higher self. In some traditions, it's called Christ consciousness. In others, Buddha nature or the Atman. Whatever the name, it actually all is pointing to the same reality, which is, from my perspective, this divine spark that is not separate from us. It's not outside of us. It is us, right? I need to take a breath while I say that, because here is what really also feels important to say in this moment. Getting to that kind of presence is not about striving to become someone else. I think that's often what many people think it is, right? It's not about ascending into some perfected version of ourselves. That's kind of how Jesus has been painted. And I think that was an incorrect interpretation of what Christ consciousness really is, because it is about remembering. It is about recovering the actual brilliance that has been there all along. Remember, Christ's own words were, the kingdom of heaven is within you. So from an analytic lens, this really makes me think about the enormous psychic effort that goes into keeping parts of ourselves at bay. I mean, people will go to great lengths to not know what they know, or to not bring awareness to what is really going on, right? These are the parts of our story we would rather just not touch. Sometimes it's the grief, the rage, feelings of vulnerability, our desire, our hunger, our longing. These are the parts that have often felt unwelcome or dangerous in our family or our culture. And so we push them down, we lock them away, we exile them, we stop being able to, or we may never see them as a part of us, and we will find them all around us. This is where projection happens, right? Where we see the dark, icky, longing, desire, the rage, the vulnerability. We'll look at that and judge it outside of us in everyone else without recognizing we're seeing the mirror to ourselves. But all of that energy, that labor of like keeping all of this hidden, it also dims our own light. It takes up psychic energy. It takes up psychic space. It pulls us out of our own presence. So you see, the work there is not trying to like become something new. It's just about recovering these things that we've hidden within ourselves, bringing back all of those lost pieces of ourselves, and beginning to reclaim the brilliance that we once believed we had to protect or to bury away. You know, what's coming to mind for me is in shamanic wisdom, you know, there's this idea of soul retrieval. this idea that in different lifetimes, we've left parts of ourselves, or that they've been energetically kind of usurped at different points. And I think that's really speaking to this psychic phenomenon as well. I think that every experience that we can read about in other cultures or traditions, it's like these fractals of information that are speaking the same things or speaking to the same things using different words to describe them, different language. So as we reclaim that brilliance that we have had to protect or bury away, our presence becomes fuller. It becomes more clear, more authentic, more magnetic. We stop externalizing all of our power onto other people, onto other institutions or authority figures or so-called saviors. And we actually begin to live from this recognition that that divine source that we're seeking has actually always been within us, right? Collectively, I really think that this card is signaling a larger shift where more and more of us are being called into this kind of authenticity, into living unapologetically from our wholeness. I think that's some of the freedom that people feel in TikTok as a social media platform. So much of Facebook, we was referenced as sort of like the highlight reel of people's lives. And similarly with Instagram, but it's very curated imagery and these kinds of things. But TikTok has leaned more into authenticity, the ability to just show up and start talking as though it is your online journal. And I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people use it, but I'm very aware that it is that authenticity that has made the platform boom so much, is because it's allowing people to connect unapologetically from the wholeness of who they are, right? And that is what we're all being called into this way of being where the idea of I am isn't just like a statement of existence, like I am Marrissa, but of our actual essence, right? Like I am here. I am enough. I am powerful. I am divine. Right? And this matters not just for our personal lives, but really for the collective, because every time one person returns to their own presence, it ripples outward. It creates resonance. It begins to open the field for others to actually really remember themselves too. I just talked about this recently in the soul circle that I held for members of my community. It was called the Architecture of Inner Wealth. And so if you're interested in that, I'll put the replay in the show notes so you can sign up for that as well. But there really is evidence to the ways that when we do this work within ourselves, it does ripple outward. What we make available in ourselves, we also make available to others. So as you hear all of this, I do invite you again into just a moment of reflection. What parts of myself have I been holding at bay? What brilliance has been dimmed by fear or shame? And what might it mean in this season to simply stand in my presence and say, I am? Because I think that the great paradox is this: when we stop striving to be more, instead remember the truth of who we actually already are, our light naturally expands. It's just the natural extension. And from that presence, we aren't just leading differently and living differently. We really become the field that others can anchor into and do the same kind of work, right? So with that, as we bring this October Oracle journey to a close, I'd like us to remember this arc that we've walked together. So karma and freedom reminds us that All of the patterns that we resist are the doorways. They are the very doorways to our liberation. Warrior woman and pillar of light came forward to remind us that courage is born in the presence of fear. And our task is actually not to bypass, but to embody. That is to become the channel where heaven and earth meet. The word integration, right? And finally, I am presence is reminding us of the brilliance that we recover when we will stop hiding from ourselves, from the world, and when we reclaim these exiled parts of ourselves. And when we stand unapologetically in the truth of who we are. So, taken together, I believe that these cards are not just telling a story for October, of course. I think this is the map of a path that we can walk every day and throughout our lifetime, really. Meeting our karma, if we want to call it that, with awareness, and meeting our fear with our courage, and living from the wholeness of our presence. I think that's the invitation that I'd like to leave you with. Notice this week where resistance is showing up in your life. Where is fear rising when you get closer to your calling? What would it feel like to step toward it rather than away from it? And every time you do, you're making space for more freedom. Every time you do, you are recovering more and more of your own brilliance. And every time you do, you're also rippling that out into the collective field. Now, before we close, I want to extend an invitation for you. If you're really enjoying these conversations, I'd love for you to join my email list. That is where I will send more riffs, reveries, reflections all throughout the month. And it's also where you'll be the first to know about the new offerings that I have coming. And let me just tell you, I'm really excited for the things that I have planned. I don't want you to miss them. So please do sign up. You'll find the link in the show notes for that. And with that said, I want to thank you, as always, for being here. Thank you so much for walking the path with me and for bringing your presence here with me into this space. As always, let the reverie lead you. Bye for now.